I read Improving Adolescent Literacy and the Content Area Strategies at Work by Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey. And this book was slap full of a lot of information that could help in the secondary classroom with improving students' literacy, starting from the very first page. The Chapter 1 was a lot about shifting the responsibility from the students to the teacher, because the teaching role will generally shift from questions to coaching students to generate their own questions to further their understanding. You can do this by guided discussions, timelines. There are a few common text styles, and you can use common text for the content area specifically. So if you're in an English class, you generally use fiction, and so you should give students an idea about how fiction came about so they can understand, plot, character, analysis, character development, setting, and, the types of conflict, which could, again, further their understanding and their comprehension of literacy and allowing them to grow further. There are 3 approaches to developing comprehension. The first approach is building metacognitive awareness by teaching students what to do before, during, and after the reading. This is where you would develop and maintain and evaluate a plan. And then the second step would be developing students' ability to formulate questions as they read. And then the third would be providing intentional instruction and using strategies to support their comprehension. And then some of those strategies can be think, pair, share, which we all know what that is, but summary, you would have students think something on their own, pair up, and then share, which uses a lot of the 6 literacy components. And then you have learning stations, jigsaw, and reciprocal teaching, which is student directed, and it's a jointly understand a common text for 4 people. So you would split a common text, and then they would come together and bounce ideas off together, and then come together and develop a common understanding. Chapter 2 was building anticipation, because we all know that when students are more interested in something, they're going to want to dig deeper. So there are 2, there are more than 2 activities. So there can be demonstrations, which is to illustrate and augment lecture and readings, is particularly effective for students with disabilities and ELL learners, because it involves physical and kinesthetic involvement, and it should be used very judiciously. In order to prevent confusion, a teacher must have some sort of theoretical framework, so that it allows students to, again, want to dig deeper. There is discrepant events, which are demonstrations that involve a surprising or startling occurrence. So for a history class, there was an example that said they were going over 9/11, and a random teacher just busted into the door and showed a newspaper and told her to turn the news on, and the news was obviously old and was showing the plane hitting the second building, which again can want students to allow to learn more about why and the history of what happened. There are visual displays, which use interactive technology, so the interactive whiteboards, web quests, and it uses internet, which is something that all students have access to because of the phones, and there are more computers in classrooms, and allows students to research on their own. And then we have thought-provoking questions. We went over this in class, what is a good question? A thought-provoking question itself defies a simple answer. So it's not yes or no, it's not Sacramento is the state of California, it's more of a what is justice, what is a hero, who is your hero, why is this person your hero, things like that. And then open-ended questions, like I just said, are really good for them to explain themselves. And then chapter 4 was about reading and reading alouds. Read alouds foster engagement, introduce important text to students who might not be able to understand individually. A lot of students have trouble comprehending silent reading. So as the teacher is doing the read aloud, this allows for teacher to pause and explain things that students might have questions about. In a secondary classroom, it models good reading behavior. It develops comprehension. You can use multi-dimensional text, but should not be confined. But it should stay in the content area. So in history class, you're not going to read a math book type thing. It will also engage students by hooking the text. And then shared readings is reading collaboratively with students, which serves as a bridge between read alouds and independent student reading. This allows for scaffolding to extend learning. This also allows for teacher support. The teacher can give immediate feedback, allow comprehension strategies, which the teacher would choose texts that have to deal with a specific comprehension strategy. So if you're wanting a student to develop more of an inquiry strategy, you would read a book that doesn't offer a direct ending that a student would be allowed to interpret on their own. Chapter 5 was developing questions. Many questions have little instruction in getting students to think critically. Inquiry here is really, really important. To develop a good higher order question, there are 6 levels. One of them is the first one, knowledge, which is just the terms and definitions. So this is the background knowledge. This is, what does this word mean? This word means this. And then 2, comprehension, would be the change information to compare to another form. So a question like this could be, explain why Sacramento was selected as the state capital of California. 3 would be application, which is solve a new problem, which could be, what city in California would you choose as the state capital today? And then there's analysis for level number 4, which identifies components and infers causes or motives. And then a question could be, why do you believe that legislature chose to move the state capital from San Jose to Sacramento? And then a synthesis would be, create a new product using information in a novel way. So design a state capital for California that will be useful throughout the 21st century. And then number 6 would be evaluation. And this is where you make judgments and defend opinions. So a question for this would be, assess the suitability of present state capitals and make recommendations for future development. So following these 6 levels will allow a student to go from what is the state of California to why to how to what could happen next, which allows them to think critically and develop better questions to further their understanding. There is a quilt framework that could help students with this as well. There are 5 levels. So 1 would be prepare the question, 2 present the question, 3 prompt student responses, and 4 process student responses, and then 5 take time to reflect with your students. I'm willing to apologize. My dog thinks he's the star of everything in the entire world. So that's what you're hearing. Chapter 6 is to provide students to construct their understanding of a subject in ways that are less linear and therefore better suited for representing complex relationships. So students should activate prior knowledge, allow for brainstorming, record events and details, and this also serves as a review. You should use this before, during, and after, and not just a review item. So this is using charts and information and organizers to develop their understanding. This is guided note-taking. Chapter 7 is specifically on note-taking, and the key is to identify for students why their notes can be useful to them later, because a lot of students just go through the motions because taking notes is something that you're just supposed to do in school. But there is difference between note taking and note making. Note taking is students' written notes from a lecture or class discussion. But the thing about note taking is students cannot usually go and refer back because the lecture is over. They might not have used or written proper information to base their notes on. Note making, on the other hand, is recording notes from printed materials, which they can go back to because this is sometimes guided note taking, and where teachers can really direct what notes the students actually take. There are processes and products which are required for valuable notes. The process function is actually recording the notes, and then the product function is reviewing notes. You can also refer to these as encoding and external. And then encoding requires students to pay attention to the lecture while they write, which allows students to transform information and again deepens their understanding. And then the external function is an opportunity for students to review their notes and ask questions and again further their understanding with that. Some tips and tricks to have students have organized and neat functional notes are to date and label, to draw margins and keep notes to one side and pictures or diagrams or definitions on the other. And then indent to show importance, skip lines to show a change in ideas, abbreviate when possible because we know there's students who want to write every single word with proper grammar and punctuation and just copy the slide. Abbreviation is really important. Paraphrase, when students put notes into their own words, it's more likely to stick with them because sometimes they can, relate to the life that they're going through. And then to study, students can actually cover one side of the margins and then quiz themselves. There are some assessments that the teacher can use to grade the notes, which would allow for feedback. So there's a note-taking self-assessment. The teacher would pass this out and has questions like, do I remember this lecture? Can I use my notes and know exactly what I'm talking about? Things like that. And then the students or teachers can also offer students note-taking in a research grid, which the research grid comes directly from their notes. And students can then go back and see, okay, well, I missed this, let's do this better. Chapter 8 is distinguishing between learning to write and then writing to learn. Students learn to write their whole life. They begin writing their name in preschool, kindergarten. They are learning punctuation and grammar and formatting sentences and paragraphs their whole entire life. But writing to learn is an opportunity for students to recall clarity and question what they know and what they still wonder about. And it involves getting students to think about and to find the words to explain what they are learning, how they understand that learning, and what their own process of learning involves. So it allows students to reflect on the way that they have learned, and it allows students to go back and, if they have questions, maybe search for it in the way that they wrote something. And then you should apply there are 3 types of knowledge: declarative, procedural, and conditional. Declarative asks what is this? Procedural asks how did this come about? And then conditional asks when or why, like why is this happening? Why did this happen? There are some strategies, which is one being LEA, or language experience approach. Class has a discussion with the teacher, so it can be about anything, about 9/11, and then class agrees on a message. 9/11 was a very traumatic day. This happened, this happened, this happened, and the teacher actually writes message. And this approach focuses on speech to print, so students can see the process of how their speech transformed how the teacher and the whole class themselves experienced something and how they came about to write a speech, basically. Writing models Writing models often use previously published models, so students are developing something on their own. And they are using this model to write for a new experience. So they're looking at something, following the model, taking tips and tricks from the model to apply to their own writing. And then there are generative sentences, which students write a sentence about a certain word in a given position. So the word could be something like volcanoes, and volcanoes has to be in the third placement. And then so the student could write, I like volcanoes, and then they go on from there. So when a volcano erupts, it is really hot, and then so on and so on. It allows students to base their learning and challenge their brains to develop better sentences from their experience. And chapter 9 was about assessments, and they just really, the book really emphasized that the right assessment will show what students know in diverse ways. So a writing assessment is not going to show how students have learned. Multiple choice is not going to show how a student learned, or why a student learned this, or why a student believed this. They believe that a assessment should have many different parts, many different opportunities for students to express their knowledge. There are informal and then formal assessments, and then informal is something like observations, conferences, and self-assessments, and maybe even some surveys. And then formal assessment is norm reference, which is there's two types of formal assessments. Norm reference, which is constructed using a large participants who are carefully included to reflect a larger population. So there are many demographics, ages, grades that represent their specific. So you can have 500 first graders that range from 7 to 9 who live in different areas, who grew up in different ways, and then they combine the test score, and this is a reflection of a larger population, and then they give that out. And then there are criterion reference assessments, which measure students against an expectation, which is most often the state standards. And again, these can vary by state. My articles that I read completely agree with this book. There are many different ways to express a need for literacy and a need for improvement. And there are many strategies. You could open Google and find 1,000 ways to incorporate more room for improvement. And they're just saying that the need is vastly large, and that as teachers is our job is to help students become more and more literate as they go on.